Today, we will be doing a short mind map on reproduction in plants. Sexual reproduction in plants occurs at the flowers, whose half section can be seen here. Let's begin with the male reproductive parts of flowers. Firstly, we have the anther, which is the part that produces and contains the pollen. Each anther consists of two lobes, with each lobe consisting of two pollen sacs. Pollen grains produced in the anther are stored in the pollen sacs and are released when the anther splits open upon maturity. Pollen grains are structures that carry the male gamete of the plant. The anther is held up by a filament, which is a stalk that positions the anther for optimum dispersal. For example, some flowers have filaments which hangs the anthers outside the flower, so that pollen grains can be caught and dispersed by wind. The anther and the filament make up the male reproductive parts of plants, which is referred to as the stamen. A flower may have multiple stamens. As for the female reproductive parts, we first have the stigma, which is a structure at the end of the style. This is where the female reproductive system receives pollen grains from the anther. The stigma is held up by a style, which is a stalk that connects the stigma to the ovary. The style is often long so as to hold the stigma up in a best position to trap pollen grains. The ovary here is what eventually develops into fruit upon successful pollination and fertilization. It contains at least one ovule, but usually contains more. The ovules within the ovaries are the female reproductive organs and is what develops into the seeds of the fruit. Ovules produce ova, which is the female gamete. All of these make up the female reproductive system of flowering plants, which is referred to as the pistil. Flowers often have a single pistil but may have several. For a flower to turn into a fruit, two processes must first happen. The first is pollination, which is basically what we have covered so far. Pollination is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from an anther to a stigma. There are two types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is pollination whereby pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower but of the same plant. For self-pollination to occur, the plant and hence its flowers must be bisexual. The anthers and stigmas must also mature at the same time. One characteristic of flowers that undergo self-pollination is its anthers and stigmas being situated close to each other. Some self-pollinating flowers may not even open. Intuitively, cross-pollination is therefore pollination whereby pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of another flower on a different plant, but of the same species. This is the case for dioecious plants, where the flowers of plants are only male or female. Cross-pollination can also occur for bisexual plants and flowers. However, this is usually because of their stigmas and anthers maturing at different times. There are advantages and disadvantages to both forms of pollination, and you will need to be able to compare them. The main advantage of cross-pollination surrounds its provision of greater genetic variation, as the gametes come from two different parents. This allows the offspring to potentially inherit the beneficial qualities of both parents, which gives it a biological advantage and hence increases the offspring's survival rate. Cross-pollination also increases the probability of offspring being heterozygous, which reduces the chance of harmful alleles being expressed. Lastly, cross-pollination produces more viable seeds, which increases the success rate of germination. The disadvantage of cross-pollination is that it requires two parents, where one plant cannot reproduce by itself. It is also more dependent on external factors such as insect pollinators and wind. As a result, the rate of successful pollination of such plants is lower, which causes more pollen grains and energy to be wasted. As for self-pollination, its advantages and disadvantages are almost the opposite of cross-pollination. The first advantage of self-pollination is that it requires only one parent. Therefore, a plant can produce offspring even if it is growing by itself. There is a higher probability and hence success rate of pollination occurring. This is because the anthers and stigmas of self-pollinating flowers are often close to each other, and pollination is less dependent on external factors. As a result, less pollen grains and energy are wasted. Genetically speaking, self-pollination is beneficial as the parent and offspring will be genetically similar. Therefore, the beneficial qualities of the parent are more likely to be passed on to the offspring. On the flip side, This also means that there is a higher probability that harmful alleles are passed on from the parent to its offspring. Lastly, due to self-pollination, there is a minimal genetic variation, which makes the species less adaptable to changes. The IB syllabus does not require you to know this much about pollination. You only need to know what it is and how it relates to sexual reproduction in plants. However, it will be beneficial to be able to compare the two forms of pollination, as their arguments are similar to asexual versus sexual reproduction. Additionally, with regard to pollination, a common nature of science link comes in the form of mutualism, where there is a mutualistic relationship between plants and pollinators. An example of this is the mutualistic relationship between plants and insects, where plants benefit by its flowers being pollinated and the insects benefit by obtaining nectar and pollen, which is a source of energy and protein respectively for them. After pollination, the next process that has to happen is fertilization. Just like pollination, the biology syllabus does not require you to know the process of fertilization. You only need to know what it is and its role in sexual reproduction of flowering plants. However, I'll briefly describe how fertilization happens. Upon successful pollination, pollen grains germinate in response to the sugary fluid on the stigma. Pollen tubes grow from each pollen grain, and the male gametes enter the pollen tubes. For the pollen tube to grow toward the ovary, it secretes enzymes to digest the tissues of the stigma and style. Upon reaching the ovary, it then enters the ovule through an opening called a micropyle. Once inside the ovule, the tip of the pollen tubes absorbs sap and bursts to release the male gametes. Fertilization is completed once the nucleus of one male gamete fuses with the nucleus of the ovum to form a zygote. Therefore, fertilization is the process where a sperm cell fuses with an egg within the ovule. Lastly, let's finish up with flowering. Flowering is triggered by phytochromes, which are photoreceptors found in plants. Phytochromes have two interconvertible forms, phytochrome R and phytochrome Fr. The conversion of phytochromes between these two forms depends on the amount of darkness the plant is exposed to. Between the two, phytochrome R is more stable. Therefore, phytochrome Fr will naturally convert to phytochrome R in the dark. Phytochromes are sensitive to specific wavelengths of light, where in far-red light, with wavelengths of around 730 nanometers, phytochrome Fr is rapidly converted to phytochrome R. However, in the presence of red or white light, phytochrome R is rapidly converted to phytochrome Fr. Sunlight naturally contains more wavelengths of light closer to red light as compared to far-red light. Therefore, during long days where the plant is exposed to shorter lengths of darkness, there will naturally be more phytochrome Fr. The concentration of this phytochrome is the stimulus for flowering. For long day plants, where the time spent in darkness is very short, the concentration of phytochrome Fr in the plant is much higher, which triggers flowering. On the flip side, for short day plants, due to the long time spent in darkness, there is little to no phytochrome Fr present in the plant, which triggers its flowering. Therefore, this is how phytochromes control flowering, where plants can generally be classified as either short day or long day plants. One thing I would like to highlight in my explanation is that it is the length of time the plant spends in darkness that triggers flowering. Therefore, when explaining what controls flowering in plants, do internalize and explain it as the length of night rather than the length of day. The length of night necessary for a plant to flower is referred to as its critical night length. Only when the critical night length is achieved with no light interruptions will a plant begin to flower. This brings me to the end of my mind map on reproduction in plants. Hope you found it useful and have a good day.